In 1953, a copywriter at Pond's extract company typed a headline that would define an era. "Your skin owes you a debt, and cold cream is the currency." The advertisement ran in 17 national magazines simultaneously, accompanied by a photograph of a woman in a silk dressing gown, fingertips pressed softly against her jawline, eyes closed in what could only be described as ecstatic gratitude. That woman was not washing her face. She was, according to Pons, performing an act of devotion. And the distinction mattered enormously to the millions of American women who tore that page from their copy of McCall's, folded it with religious care and tucked it into the drawer of their vanity tables. The cold cream ritual had existed in various forms since the Roman physician Galen first mixed beeswax, water, and rose oil into a white cooling salve around the 2nd century. But the 1950s transformed what had been a simple cleansing habit into a full theatrical production, a nightly ceremony with its own props, its own choreography, and its own deeply felt emotional stakes. To understand why, you have to understand what the decade was asking of women's faces. Urban air in 1950 was genuinely hostile. Coal furnaces still heated most city apartments. Factory smoke had not yet met the resistance of clean air legislation. Women who commuted, and increasingly many did, arrived home each evening carrying the city on their skin in a very literal sense. Particulates, exhaust, and the residue of what trade journals at the time cheerfully called industrial fallout. Soap and water alone, as any cold cream advertisement of the period was happy to explain in clinical detail, simply pushed this grime around. What the modern face required was a solvent, and cold cream, with its high oil content acting as emulsifying agent, genuinely delivered. Pond's cold cream and Woodbury's facial soap were not competing products so much as they were competing philosophies with matching advertising budgets. Pond's, founded in Connecticut in 1846 and acquired by the Anglo-Dutch conglomerate Lever Brothers in 1927, had spent decades carefully building an identity around the idea that beautiful skin was a woman's birthright, but only if she worked for it. Their cold cream came in a wide-mouthed glass jar with a distinctive thick white lid, and the ritual it prescribed was specific. Apply generously in upward circular motions, allow to sit for 60 seconds while the cream absorbs and lifts surface impurities, then tissue away in downward strokes. The motion sequence was non-negotiable. The directional logic was rooted in the period's understanding of facial muscle structure, which held that downward pressure accelerated sagging, while upward strokes counteracted gravity's ongoing ambitions. Whether this was scientifically valid by modern dermatological standards is beside the point. In 1950, it was received wisdom with the authority of fact, and women followed the protocol with a discipline that would have impressed a military drill instructor. Woodbury's approach was more sensual, more aspirational in a different direction. Their advertisements leaned heavily on the language of cinema, frequently pairing photographs of their facial soap with references to the kind of dewy, luminescent skin that studio lighting made famous. The brand's slogan, "A skin you love to touch," had been in circulation since 1911, when the J. Walter Thompson advertising agency pioneered one of the first frankly erotic appeals in American advertising history. By the 1950s, the slogan was so embedded in the culture that women no longer needed to read it to feel its implication. The jar itself communicated desire, reciprocity, reward. Layered between these two commercial titans were dozens of smaller preparations that the well-equipped vanity table held in rotation. Vanishing creams, which were oil in water emulsions so light they seemed to disappear on contact, and left behind a matte base ideal for daytime foundation application. Night creams, heavier preparations enriched with lanolin or mineral oil, intended to work their moisture-trapping magic during the 8 hours when no one would see the greasy evidence, and eye creams, which occupied a specialized niche and arrived in miniature jars that suggested, through sheer packaging intimacy, that the skin around the eye was a jurisdiction requiring its own governance. Helena Rubinstein's pasteurized face cream, sold in a clinical white jar that telegraphed scientific authority, appealed to women who distrusted glamour and wanted their skincare to resemble medicine. Elizabeth Arden's 8-hour cream, a thick amber balve with a faintly petroleum-adjacent scent, was the working woman's multi-tool applied equally to chapped lips, dry elbows, cuticles, and the inner corners of eyes. It smelled like productivity. The cold cream cleanse never existed in isolation. It was the opening movement of a composition that could run anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour, depending on the woman's commitment level and the demands of the following day. After tissuing away the first application, a woman might apply a second, lighter layer and repeat the lifting process. Then toner, usually an astringent in those years, which meant it contained some percentage of alcohol and caused a bracing, stinging sensation against newly cleaned skin that most women interpreted as evidence of efficacy. Pain meant it was working. Then the night cream. Then, for the seriously devoted, a strip of white cosmetic gauze laid over the neck cream to hold the preparation in place while sleeping, a practice that required a particular kind of psychological acceptance of one's own appearance as a construction site. The magazines called this the full treatment. Husbands were presumably prepared for it. What 1950s cold cream culture understood, in ways that have circled back into modern skincare consciousness, was that the ritual mattered as much as the formula. The act of standing at a mirrored vanity table in a lit room at the end of a day that had made considerable demands, and deliberately methodically attending to one's own face. This was not vanity in any pejorative sense. It was for many women navigating the pressures of post-war domestic ideology, the one uninterrupted quarter hour of the day that belonged entirely to them. The cold cream jar was a locked door that no one thought to knock on. And in the 1950s, that was a more radical privacy than it might first appear. What the advertisements never quite explained, but what every woman who used cold cream already understood intuitively, was that the formula's effectiveness depended on a chemical reality that the beauty industry preferred to describe in poetic rather than technical terms. Oil and grease dissolve oil and grease. The fundamental principle that like dissolves like meant that the lanolin and mineral oil in a jar of Pond's were genuinely superior to water-based cleansers for removing the oil-based cosmetics that the decade's beauty standards required women to apply every morning. Foundation of the period was formulated on oil or wax bases. Lipstick was wax-based. Mascara was oil-based. Cold cream did not merely suggest to these preparations that they leave the face, it provided the chemical conditions under which their departure was chemically compelled. This was, in a very real sense, the first evidence-based skincare practice that millions of American women performed daily, even if neither they nor the companies selling them the product framed it in those terms. The tissue question, what you used to remove the dissolved preparation, was not as trivial as it sounds in retrospect. Early facial tissues were thicker and rougher than their modern successors, and some dermatologists of the period advised against their use on particularly sensitive skin, recommending instead small squares of soft lint-free cotton or old linen handkerchiefs softened through years of laundering. Puffs of cotton wool, available in economy bags at every drugstore, were considered the gentlest option, and the deliberate, gentle downward and outward motion with which they were drawn across cream-laden skin was a motion that beauty manuals described with enough specificity to fill multiple paragraphs. Downward from forehead to brow, outward from nose to cheekbone, under the chin in an outward sweep that addressed the throat without dragging the fragile skin beneath the jaw. Never circular, never horizontal. The directional logic was relentless. The scent of mid-century cold cream was, for an entire generation of women, the olfactory signature of a particular time of day, that hour after dinner, but before complete rest when the social performance of the day was technically over, but its physical residue remained, coating the face in the foundation and powder and rouge that had constituted the day's public face. Pond's original cold cream had a distinctly mineral, slightly floral scent. Rosewater was a historical ingredient, though its concentration in the commercial product was modest. That was almost entirely unlike the perfumed sophistication of the daytime cosmetics it was removing. This was intentional. The scent of cold cream was the scent of reduction, of return, of the private self that existed beneath the public construction. Children who grew up in 1950s households have reported decades later that the smell of cold cream remains among their most immediate sensory associations with the presence of their mothers, specifically their mothers in transition, partially undone, available in a way that the fully composed daytime version was not. The vanishing cream occupied a different niche in the skincare hierarchy and deserves separate attention from its cold cream counterpart. Where cold cream was oily and substantial, vanishing cream was an oil in water emulsion. Technically, the water was the continuous phase, which meant the preparation felt light, absorbed quickly, and left behind a very slight powdery residue that provided a smooth base for foundation application. The name referred, with elegant literalness, to the cream's tendency to disappear on contact with the skin, leaving no visible trace of its application. Pond's vanishing cream competed directly with Jergens, with Noxzema-medicated skin cream, whose camphor and eucalyptus scent was so distinctive that it achieved the status of a cultural memory all on its own, and with a range of department store preparations that occupied the premium tier of the market, and came in packaging that communicated their aspiration to be taken seriously as science. The bridge between the cold cream night ritual and the foundation morning application was almost always a toner, and the toners of the 1950s operated on a philosophy so different from contemporary toning products that the same word barely covers both categories. Modern toners are largely water-based, pH balancing preparations that restore the skin's acid mantle after cleansing. The astringents of the 1950s were bracing. They contained significant percentages of either isopropyl or ethyl alcohol, frequently combined with witch hazel, sometimes with boric acid, and occasionally with menthol or camphor, ingredients whose collective effect on freshly cleansed skin was a sharp, involuntary inhalation, and a sensation that the advertising copy of the period called refreshing, and that honest testimony might have called briefly alarming. The logic was coherent by the standards of the time. The tightening sensation that alcohol produced on skin was interpreted as evidence that pores were closing, and closed pores were the architectural objective of the entire cleansing process. Enlarged pores were the decade's foremost dermatological anxiety. The astringent addressed them. Whether it addressed them successfully by any definition that a contemporary esthetician would recognize is a separate matter. The women using it felt the tightening and believed in the closing, and the belief was its own kind of reward. The relationship between cold cream and the broader concept of the nighttime beauty routine was also, in the most practical sense, a relationship with time, specifically with the time that elapsed between the end of the social day and the beginning of sleep. In 1953, this window was longer and more deliberately managed than it might appear from the outside. The post-war domestic schedule, shaped by a husband who returned from work between 5 and 6 in the evening, and a household that expected dinner on the table within a reasonable window of that return, compressed the afternoon into a series of timed preparations that left little room for private activity. The night time, by contrast, the hour or two after the children were in bed, and the dishes were done and the husband had settled into his newspaper, or the television that was appearing with increasing frequency in American living rooms, offered a window of time that was, in an important sense, genuinely unscheduled. The cold cream ritual filled that window deliberately, transforming what might have been a 2-minute functional face washing into a 15 to 30-minute investment in the maintenance of one's own body. Helena Rubinstein, whose empire extended across 2 continents, and whose personal approach to skincare was as rigorous as her approach to business, wrote in her 1930 memoir that a woman who did not care for her skin was a woman who had given up on herself, a statement that was characteristically direct and characteristically Rubinstein in its equation of skincare with self-regard rather than vanity. By the 1950s, this equation had been thoroughly absorbed by the beauty industry at large and translated into the marketing language of a dozen competing brands. The nighttime skincare ritual was reframed not as labour, but as luxury, specifically a luxury of the most democratically available kind, one that cost only the price of a jar of cold cream and the willingness to claim 30 uninterrupted minutes at the end of a long day. This framing was commercially effective and also, in a quieter way, genuinely true. The zinc vanity table that appeared in the popular imagination of the mid-century bedroom, its cool metal surface, its 3-panelled mirror offering the dual profile views that allowed a woman to assess the back of her hair and the full line of her jaw simultaneously, its small drawers organised by product category, was as much a cultural symbol as a piece of furniture. It was the domestic altar at which the daily beauty ritual was performed, and its presence in the bedroom communicated something specific about the household's priorities and self-image. A woman with a proper vanity table had a designated space for her cosmetics, which meant she had cosmetics worth designating space for, which meant she was the kind of woman who invested in her appearance in a deliberate and organised way. The vanity table without its requisite cold cream, toner, night cream, and the half-dozen smaller preparations that supported the primary ritual would have looked, to the period's eye, as incomplete as a kitchen without its pots. On a Tuesday morning in October of 1955, a MGM makeup artist named William Tuttle arrived at Soundstage 14 at 6:45 in the morning and spent the next 2 hours and 20 minutes constructing a face that would appear on screen for a combined total of perhaps 11 minutes. The face belonged to an actress playing a society hostess in a drawing room drama that almost no one remembers today. The time invested was not exceptional, it was the standard. In the 1950s, the Hollywood studio makeup department operated on the understanding that every face that appeared before a camera, regardless of role size, screen time, or billing position, represented a deliberate aesthetic argument, and that argument required craftsmanship, time, and a considerable amount of industrial-grade pancake foundation. The mid-century Hollywood starlet operated in a system of visual archetypes so clearly defined that they functioned almost as dress codes. At one pole stood Grace Kelly, whose presentation was built on the architecture of restraint, cool, pale foundation that read on Technicolor film as porcelain, brows shaped into gentle, precise arches with no dramatic penciling, lips in soft pinks and nude roses, rather than the aggressive reds that dominated the decade's commercial advertising. Her eye makeup was carefully understated, liner applied in a thin, controlled line that emphasized the eye's shape rather than dramatizing it. Everything about Kelly's screen presentation said that beauty of this caliber required no effort, which was, of course, the most labor-intensive illusion the MGM makeup department had ever been asked to maintain. Skin with that degree of visible perfection required 4 separate foundation applications, set with pressed powder between each layer, sealed finally with a fine mist of mineral water that an assistant spritzed from a distance of 18 inches to preserve the powdered finish without disturbing it. At the other pole stood Marilyn Monroe, whose relationship with cosmetics was something closer to sculpture than decoration. Monroe's signature look, the one that Pace magazine covers, billboard advertisements, and movie stills reproduced until it achieved the status of cultural mythology, was the product of a highly specific set of deliberate technical choices made collaboratively between Monroe, her personal makeup artist Whitey Snyder, and the evolving vocabulary of 1950s beauty. The bleached platinum hair, maintained through weekly applications of a hydrogen peroxide formula that studio colorists guarded with the possessiveness of proprietary research, provided the luminous frame. The foundation was applied in multiple tones, slightly darker at the outer edges of the face, lighter at the centre and on the brow bone, to create a 3-dimensional roundness that camera lenses of the period tended to flatten. The lips were lined slightly outside their natural border, then filled in with a red so deep it photographed as almost black in the white and white productions, and blazed incandescently in the colour ones. Monroe's lips were, in the technical language of contemporary cosmetics, the signature product of a different era's understanding of sex and power, and everything else on her face was arranged to deliver the eye toward them. Between these 2 iconic poles, Women watching from their seats in the darkened movie houses of 1951, 1953, 1957 were absorbing something far more complex than entertainment. They were receiving instruction. The connection between what they saw on screen and what they subsequently purchased at the drugstore or the department store cosmetics counter was not incidental. It was the explicit business model of an industry that had understood since the 1920s that cinema was the most powerful advertising medium ever developed. Max Factor, whose Hollywood division had invented the first panchromatic foundation specifically designed for use under studio lights, had built an entire consumer cosmetics line, bearing the same Max Factor name, on the premise that any woman, given the right products, could translate the mechanics of studio glamour into her daily life. The advertising language was precise about this. The makeup of the stars, not inspired by the stars, not reminiscent of the stars, the actual technical preparation delivered to your bathroom shelf in a compact or a cake. Theatrical costuming at the studio level operated under similarly codified principles. Studio wardrobe departments maintained meticulous records of the visual effect created by every fabric, colour and cut combination, as rendered on Technicolor or black and white film stock, and these observations had hardened into something resembling scientific law. Fabric with too much sheen created halation around the actress's figure and drew the eye away from her face. Deep jewel tones read beautifully in colour, but could overwhelm a pale complexion in close-up. Structured garments with pronounced shoulder construction and narrow waists created the hourglass silhouette that 1950s cinema had decided was the visually correct shape of desirable femininity. Every choice in the wardrobe department was a choice about the geometry of the woman wearing it, and the cumulative effect of 10,000 such choices, broadcast from screens in 4,000 American cinemas simultaneously, was the gradual establishment of an aesthetic consensus that women carried home with them like light in their eyes. What makes the matinee archetype genuinely fascinating from a historical distance is the complete absence of ambiguity it projected. Grace Kelly and Marilyn Monroe represented opposite strategies, but both operated within a shared framework that insisted a woman's appearance was a communication, a carefully crafted statement about who she was, what she valued, and what she was offering the world. The modern notion of beauty as self-expression, fluid and personal and unmoored from the need for legibility, would have read as chaos to the 1950s studio system. Beauty was not personal in that world, it was a public contract. And the matinee archetypes were its most eloquent signatories. The studio system's control over a performer's physical presentation extended far beyond the makeup chair, and understanding the full scope of that control illuminates why the visual archetypes it produced were so precisely defined and so culturally durable. Under the long-term contracts that major studios maintained with their roster players throughout the 1940s and into the 50s, the studio held approval over everything connected with the performer's public image: hairstyle, wardrobe, the photographers permitted to shoot them, the publications in which their photographs could appear, and, in the most comprehensive contracts, the public statements they were permitted to make about their own appearance and their beauty routines. A performer who changed her hair colour without studio approval could face a suspension clause. A performer who appeared in public photographs in an unapproved style, that is, a style that contradicted the visual identity the studio had constructed for her, was in breach of an obligation that the contract described in language indistinguishable from property law. The studio owned the image, the performer inhabited it. This is the context in which the specific details of Grace Kelly's screen presentation, those painstakingly constructed layers of pale foundation, the 4 separate application passes, the mineral water mist, acquire their full meaning. Kelly's image was the product of a collaborative negotiation between her own aesthetic preferences, the visual requirements of Technicolor film stock, the house style of MGM, and the accumulated wisdom of makeup artists who had spent decades learning what worked and what didn't on specific combinations of bone structure, colouring, and camera angle. The paleness that reads as effortless aristocratic luminosity in her films was the result of foundation mixed lighter than Kelly's actual skin tone, a technique that created the glow by reflecting more light than natural skin would, combined with a powder setting that eliminated the surface oils that caused otherwise perfect foundation to shift colour under hot studio lights over the course of a shooting day. Every choice was a technical solution to a technical problem. The effect was transcendence. Marilyn Monroe's use of the camera was technically the opposite of Kelly's, not in quality of craft but in philosophy of address. Kelly's image was constructed to be observed from the position of a respectful audience, encountering something elevated and slightly remote. Monroe's image was constructed to be encountered, face to face, in a relationship of mutual recognition that cinema had rarely managed with such directness. The technical choices that Whitey Snyder made, the slightly overlined lips that created an apparent fullness beyond Monroe's natural mouth, the brow groomed to a fine arch that lifted and expanded the eye area, the foundation blend that created dimensionality in a face the camera would otherwise flatten, were all serving a single goal, the sensation in the person watching that Monroe was looking specifically at them. In a medium that generally asked audiences to observe rather than participate, this was an unusual and powerful form of address, and it required unusual technical specificity to achieve. Monroe was not the beneficiary of innate photogenicity, whatever the myth machine suggested. She was the product of thousands of hours of collaborative aesthetic engineering. The genius was real. So was the labour. The consumer translation of studio glamour into drugstore and department store products was managed by the cosmetics industry through a system of product endorsements, licensing arrangements, and carefully calibrated marketing that made the gap between the screen ideal and the consumer purchase seem navigable rather than insurmountable. Max Factor's advertisements in the early 1950s regularly featured photographs of Hollywood performers alongside photographs of non-performer women who had used the same Max Factor products, and the visual rhetoric was explicit. The performer was not a departure from the norm but its apotheosis, and the norm was available to any woman with $2.49. This was, in the historical context of advertising, a relatively new kind of claim. Earlier beauty advertising had leaned on aspiration, the suggestion that a product might improve your appearance in the direction of an ideal. But mid-century cosmetics advertising was making a stronger argument, that the ideal itself was manufactured through products you could buy, and that the manufacture was therefore accessible to you. The democratization of glamour was, in the 1950s, both the industry's most powerful marketing claim and a reasonably accurate description of what cosmetics technology had actually achieved. The tools existed. The results varied. The promise was not entirely hollow. The casting system that organized Hollywood performers into specific archetypes was not experienced by the performers themselves as the creative limitation that posterity tends to read it as. The actress who had been typed, identified by the studio system as corresponding to a specific visual and behavioral archetype, had been given something valuable in addition to something constraining. A coherent identity that the public could track across multiple films, a consistent set of visual signifiers that made her recognizable to an audience that might encounter a dozen different films in the course of a year and needed reliable shorthand for navigating them. Grace Kelly's paleness and restraint were not simply a personal aesthetic. They were a brand identity as precisely engineered as any corporate logo, and the engineering served the performer's commercial interests at the same time that it served the studio's. The constraint was real, so was the benefit. The male perspective on 1950s Hollywood female presentation was, predictably, the perspective that the industry most directly served, but the female audience's relationship with the archetypes was more complex than a simple object of the male gaze. Women watching Grace Kelly or Marilyn Monroe were performing a double act of spectatorship. They were watching a performance that was, on one level, constructed for male approval, and simultaneously they were watching a technical demonstration, an education in the visual mechanics of femininity, a masterclass in the deployment of cosmetics, clothing, and physical presentation as a deliberate art form. The pleasure they took in watching was not identical to the pleasure their male counterparts took, and contemporary letters, diary entries, and fan magazine correspondence from the period suggest that women's engagement with Hollywood archetypes was often explicitly educational in its orientation. Women wrote to fan magazines not only to express admiration for performers, but to ask specific questions about makeup technique, about the names of the nail polish colours, about where the dress in a specific scene had been made. The star was a demonstration. The audience was taking notes. The influence of the studio makeup vocabulary on mainstream American beauty practices was mediated through a set of consumer products that tracked the professional formulas closely, but adapted them for non-professional application. Pancake Foundation, the Max Factor product that had been developed for cinema and then released to the consumer market, was the most direct translation. A pressed cake formula applied with a damp sponge that produced a heavier coverage than liquid foundations of the period, and was openly marketed with reference to its Hollywood origins. Women who purchased Pancake were purchasing access to the technical methodology of the studio makeup department, and they used it with the seriousness that the purchase implied. The result was not quite the studio finish. Home lighting, amateur application technique, and the absence of the professional photographer's skill at working with what the makeup had produced all introduced variables that the studio environment controlled. But it was a genuine approximation, and the approximation was the point. The studio had created the ideal. The consumer product had created the means of pursuit. The pursuit itself was the transaction that the industry had been engineering from the beginning. In 1952, a beauty editor at Harper's Bazaar named Carmel Snow watched a backstage makeup demonstration and wrote a single line in her notes that her assistant later typed up and filed, "The eye is the argument." She was watching a makeup artist named Pablo Manzoni apply liquid liner to a model's eyes with a brush so fine it had been cut down to 7 bristles. The total application time was 9 minutes per eye. The result, under studio lights, was a precision that Snow compared in her published column to Japanese calligraphy. A line so controlled, so intentionally placed, that it appeared to have been drawn not on skin, but on the retina of everyone looking at it. That column ran in October of that year, and by December, sales of Revlon's Flare liquid liner had increased by 43%. The Doe Eye had found its publicist, and America was ready for the conversion. The technical history of eyeliner runs back centuries, through the kohl-rimmed eyes of ancient Egypt and the theatrical grease paint traditions of European stage performance. But the specifically 1950s iteration of the art, the clean, winged, geometric line that transformed the upper lid into a conscious design object, required a new generation of product formulations to achieve it. Early liquid liners were essentially India ink, with a tiny amount of gum arabic to improve adhesion to skin, and they were temperamental in the extreme. They dried unevenly, they smudged, they cracked. A woman who blinked too enthusiastically in the first 4 minutes after application might find her carefully achieved liner transferred in fragmentary horror to her upper eyelid. Hazel Bishop, the chemist-turned-cosmetics entrepreneur who had already revolutionized the lipstick market with her long-lasting no-smear formula, turned her considerable technical intelligence toward the liner problem in the early 50s and arrived at a cellulose polymer suspension that dried to a flexible, crack-resistant film. The difference in wear was dramatic, but the real democratizing breakthrough was the applicator. The brush applicator, a slender wand, preloaded with a small reservoir of liner and fitted with a tapered brush tip, transformed liquid liner from a professional's tool into a consumer product that a woman could use independently, in her bathroom, with a reasonable expectation of consistent results. The geometry of the wing itself, which had been worked out in the studio system over the preceding decade, was now the subject of how-to columns in every beauty magazine in the country. The technique, as any Mademoiselle reader of 1954 could have recited from memory, ran as follows. Draw a thin line from the inner corner of the eye, thickening gradually as you move toward the outer corner, then lift the brush at the outer edge and extend the line in a short upward flick that followed the angle of the lower lash line extended. The result, when executed correctly, created the illusion that the eye's outer corner lifted, which was, in the decade's visual vocabulary, the difference between a face that said tired and a face that said alert. Alert was the baseline minimum requirement for public presentation. Alert was the price of admission. The doe eye effect relied not merely on liner, but on the complete orchestration of several cosmetic elements that 1950s makeup artists understood as inseparable. False lashes, strips of mink, sable, or nylon depending on the budget, anchored to the lash line with spirit gum adhesive, added the dramatic fringing that made the liner's precision visible at distance. Mascara, applied in multiple coats and combed through with a lash separator between each application, extended and darkened natural lashes until the boundary between natural and artificial became genuinely indeterminate, which was precisely the intention. Revlon's Aqualash Mascara, a cake formula that required activation with a small wet brush, was the professional standard, while Max Factor's Cream Mascara, which came in a small pot and was applied with a tiny spiral brush, offered a slightly more portable option for the woman who needed to refresh her eye makeup after lunch. The eyebrow, meanwhile, was working in conversation with all of this. The strong, slightly arched brow of the early 50s, higher than natural, extended slightly beyond the eye's outer corner, shaded with a brown or dark pencil in short feather strokes rather than solid fill, provided a counterweight to the liner's drama. The social meaning of the doe eye in 1950 was not subtle. A focused, wide, carefully defined gaze communicated attentiveness, femininity, and a kind of soft readiness for engagement that the period's social etiquette required of women in mixed company settings. The wing specifically, that upward flick at the outer corner, communicated something additional, a hint of visual wit, a suggestion that the woman wearing it was in on a private joke about the whole enterprise of decorative femininity. It was the cosmetic equivalent of an arched eyebrow in a different sense entirely. Audrey Hepburn, whose eye makeup in Roman Holiday and Sabrina became one of the most widely referenced visual references in American beauty culture of the period, wore liner with a thickness and angularity that was frankly unusual by the decade's mainstream standards. Her look was more graphic, more deliberately constructed than the gentle doe eye that fashion magazines prescribed, and the fact that it read as elegantly natural rather than theatrical spoke to the extraordinary skill of her makeup artists, and to the degree to which the doe eye aesthetic had become invisible through ubiquity. What the 1950s liquid liner revolution established, and what any woman who has stood at a bathroom mirror with an eyeliner pen at 7 a.m. can confirm from lived experience, was that the most technically demanding daily beauty practice of the decade was also the most socially consequential. A mascara smear was embarrassing. A crooked wing was a failure, and the precision demanded of the application process, the still face, the steady hand, the precise angle of the brush against skin, was itself a kind of daily discipline, a proof that you had the patience and the control to care about the details. In an era that valued a woman's capacity for meticulous invisible labour as a marker of her character, the liquid liner wing was, among other things, a performance review you gave yourself every morning. The physical challenge of liquid liner application in the home bathroom differed from its studio equivalent in several important ways, and women who attempted to replicate the precision they observed on cinema screens or in magazine photographs were confronting an equipment gap that no amount of practice could entirely bridge. Studio makeup artists worked on performers who were trained to hold perfectly still in rooms with controlled, consistent lighting, typically north-facing natural light supplemented by incandescent bulbs arranged at specific angles to eliminate shadow, using brushes that had been custom cut to their preferred specifications, and liner formulas that had been tested extensively against specific skin types and lighting conditions. The home bathroom offered fluorescent or incandescent ceiling light from a single overhead fixture, a medicine cabinet mirror with no lighting control, and a liner purchased at a Woolworths counter, by a woman who had approximately 11 minutes before she needed to leave the house. The gap between conditions was significant. The attempt was made anyway, millions of times a day, with results that range from the genuinely impressive to the philosophically adventurous. The learning curve for liquid liner was steep enough that the beauty industry developed several intermediate products designed to provide a stepping stone between pencil liner, which was forgiving, smudgeable and correctable, and the uncompromising liquid that demanded a steady hand and a willingness to start over. Cake liner, which was a pressed pigment that required activation with a wet brush, occupied a useful middle position. It produced a cleaner line than pencil but dried more slowly than liquid, providing a window for correction that pure liquid liner did not. Eyebrow pencils used double duty as liner in lower budget households, although the waxier formula produced a softer line that required powder setting to approach anything like the precision that liquid achieved. Revlon's Flare, which came in a small glass bottle with a built-in brush applicator and dried to a glossy finish, was the prestige option. The dime store equivalent, typically a small cake of compressed pigment with a miniature brush stored in a folded paper sleeve, was messier and less reliable, but cost a fraction of the price and produced results that were, in the right light, indistinguishable from the premium product. The magazine instruction columns that guided women through liquid liner application in the mid-1950s were remarkable documents of pedagogical confidence. They described the application process with the authority of tutorial manuals for technical equipment, which, in the practical sense, they were. The advice to brace the elbow against a flat surface to minimize hand tremor anticipated by several decades the surgical technique of stabilizing the operating hand. The instruction to draw the liner line in short, overlapping strokes rather than one continuous gesture, which reduced the consequences of individual slips, was genuinely useful technique that reflected accumulated practical wisdom about where liner tended to go wrong. The suggestion to keep a cotton swab dampened with astringent nearby for immediate correction assumed a bathroom arranged more like a makeup studio than most home bathrooms were, but the principle was sound. Preparation for failure was not defeatism but pragmatism. The social symbolism of the eye in mid-century beauty culture extended beyond the specific techniques used to enhance it into the broader question of what the eye was expected to communicate. In the pre-war period, heavily eye-made-up women were associated, in popular imagination and in reality, with either theatrical life or a kind of sexual availability that respectable women were expected to signal they did not possess. The wartime period had shifted this association considerably. Makeup in general became patriotic during the war years, and elaborate eye makeup in particular became associated with the confident, capable, economically independent working women who were then a significant and visible presence in public life. By the mid-1950s, the doe-eyed look had been entirely normalized within the vocabulary of respectable femininity, but it retained a residue of its theatrical origins in the way that its more dramatic versions, the extended wing, the layered false lash, the fully rimmed eye with kohl or deep brown on both lash lines, were still understood as a kind of performance rather than a simple enhancement. The woman who wore her liner in full theatrical mode to a Tuesday morning grocery run was making a statement that her immediate context did not require, and the statement was legible to everyone who observed it. She was dressed for a different occasion than the one she was in. This could be read as elegance, as aspiration, or as a mild defiance of the expectation that public life on a Tuesday morning was not an occasion worth dressing for. All three readings were, in different households, simultaneously correct. The relationship between the liquid liner wing and the concept of the finished face, the mid-century notion that a woman's public appearance was not complete until every element of it had been deliberately addressed, was intimate and defining. A face without liner was not an incomplete face in any objective sense, but within the aesthetic framework of 1955, It communicated a different set of priorities than a face with liner, a willingness to be seen without having fully assembled the visual argument, a relaxation of the social contract that public presentation implied. This was sometimes read as naturalness, occasionally as youth, frequently as a degree of informality about the current occasion that might or might not be appropriate depending on context. The woman who wore liquid liner to every social occasion, without exception, was demonstrating a consistency of presentation that the period read as reliability of character. These equations seem, in retrospect, extravagantly reductive. In 1955 they were simply the grammar of appearance, and most women had internalized them so completely that they experienced them not as external constraints, but as personal standards. In January of 1954, the Knox Gelatin Company published a diet pamphlet called Eat and Reduce that recommended, with apparent seriousness and the authority of its own commissioned nutritional research, that women consume a baseline diet of lean protein, green vegetables, and, the crucial element, 2 packets of Knox unflavoured gelatin dissolved in water each day, which the pamphlet claimed would curb appetite, strengthen the nails, improve the hair, and support the connective tissues that kept the body's various components in their correct geographic relationships. The pamphlet was free at grocery stores and drugstores. By March, Knox had distributed 1 million copies. The American woman was, in 1954, actively looking for a framework that could make sense of the body she was supposed to have, and if Knox Gelatin wanted to provide that framework at no charge, and with attractive black and white photographs, she was prepared to listen. The 1950s relationship between American women and weight management exists at the intersection of several forces that are each, independently, extraordinary, and together form one of the more revealing cultural documents of the post-war period. There was the visual standard, the hourglass silhouette that Hollywood and Vogue and the department store catalogue had collectively established as the acceptable shape, its specific proportions defined with a precision that would alarm most contemporary observers. 1953 beauty manuals were perfectly comfortable publishing the statement, alongside a helpful diagram, that the ideal woman's measurements were 36, 24, 36, and that variance from these numbers in any direction represented a problem requiring correction. There was the medical establishment, which in 1952 was still operating under a nutritional framework that bore only passing resemblance to what a modern registered dietitian would recognize as food science. And there was the food industry, which had emerged from the Second World War's rationing period with extraordinary manufacturing capacity and an urgent need for consumers who would apply it. The gelatin mould stands as the decade's most perfectly calibrated dietary object. It was simultaneously a diet food and a hostess food, which made it uniquely suited to the 1950s kitchen, where the pressure to be thin and the pressure to serve impressive meals to one's husband's colleagues were experienced as 2 poles of the same obligation. A gelatin mould, Jell-O was the dominant brand, though Royal and Knox had significant market shares, could be made with artificially sweetened powder, set with water or tomato juice instead of cream, and still presented at a dinner table with sufficient architectural ambition to communicate domestic competence. The tomato aspic ring, a savoury gelatin preparation set in a ring mould with canned vegetables suspended in glittering red suspension, appeared on the table at roughly 1 in 4 American dinner parties between 1950 and 1958, and it was almost always understood as both decoration and restraint, a signal from the hostess about what kind of household this was. Beyond gelatin, the era's diet culture produced an astonishing catalogue of nutritional strategies that ranged from the merely eccentric to the genuinely alarming. The Hollywood 18-day diet, which had nothing to do with the film industry and everything to do with the prestige of the word Hollywood in mid-century marketing, prescribed a daily menu of black coffee, hard-boiled eggs, and grapefruit, with the theory that grapefruit contained a fat-burning enzyme that activated only in the presence of protein. It contained no such enzyme. The cigarette diet, whose origins were in the early tobacco industry's advertising campaigns of the 1920s and 30s, but persisted comfortably into the 50s, operated on the premise that smoking suppressed appetite, which was, in a narrow biochemical sense, sometimes true, and that this made cigarettes a dietary aid. Lucky Strike's famous "Reach for a Lucky instead of a Sweet" campaign had been officially banned by the Federal Trade Commission in 1950, but the underlying behavioral pattern it had established in American women remained active throughout the decade. Amphetamine-based diet pills occupied a remarkable position in 1950s weight management culture. Dexedrine and benzedrine, both amphetamine compounds initially developed for other medical purposes, were prescribed by physicians for weight loss, with a casualness that reflects the era's confidence in pharmaceutical solutions and its comparative indifference to dependency. The pills were effective at suppressing appetite and producing a feeling of energized efficiency that women who took them found enormously appealing, not merely for weight management, but for the simple capacity to move through an exhausting day of domestic labor at a pace that felt superhuman. A 1953 issue of Ladies' Home Journal ran a first-person account of my reducing plan that mentioned, without comment, that the author's physician had prescribed reducing tablets that she took twice daily. The author attributed her 12-pound weight loss in 6 weeks to the combination of dietary restraint and exercise. The tablets were unnamed. Their addictive potential was unmentioned. The article's primary advice to readers was to write down everything they ate in a little notebook. The modern counterpart to all of this, the subscription app, the macro tracking spreadsheet, the before and after photograph as social media currency, is not as distant from the tomato aspic ring and the Knox gelatin pamphlet as we might prefer to believe. The underlying structure is identical. A quantified ideal, a system of practices that promises to close the gap between the current body and the ideal body, a community of women exchanging strategies and recipes and encouragement and very quiet judgment, and a commercial apparatus generating profit from the gap's continued existence. What distinguishes the 1950s model is not its extractive logic, but its innocence about that logic. Women in 1954 were not cynical about the Knox gelatin diet. They were hopeful, and hope, it turned out, was something that could be sold 1 million times at no charge and still generate returns. The domestic science movement that had been building in American universities and home extension services since the 1890s reached its fullest cultural expression precisely in the 1950s, and its influence on the decade's diet culture was pervasive and largely invisible. Home economics departments at universities across the country were, throughout the post-war period, producing nutrition curricula, meal planning guides, and research studies on women's dietary needs that were then condensed and distributed through the Cooperative Extension Service, through women's magazines, through the army of home demonstration agents who visited rural households throughout the country. This institutional infrastructure gave the decade's dietary advice its peculiar tone of scientific authority mixed with domestic practicality. It came from universities, it was endorsed by government agencies, and it arrived packaged as recipes rather than laboratory reports. The intellectual distance between the gelatin pamphlet and the peer-reviewed nutrition literature of the same period was vast. The social distance in the American household of 1954 was negligible. Calorie counting arrived in the 1950s mainstream through several simultaneous channels that reinforced each other in ways that made the practice seem both modern and inevitable. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Company's height and weight tables, first issued in 1943 and revised in 1959, provided the era's primary quantified reference for what a woman of any given height should weigh. And these tables were reproduced in women's magazines, in diet books, in doctor's office materials, and in the weight reduction advertising that companies like Slender and Metrical used to sell their meal replacement products. The tables were imprecise by any modern epidemiological standard. They were derived from insurance company actuarial data rather than population health studies, and they did not account for bone density, muscle mass, or any variable that distinguished body composition from gross weight. But they provided a specific number, and specific numbers were exactly what the period's appetite for quantified self-management required. A woman who knew that she was supposed to weigh 127 pounds, and who currently weighed 134, had a clearly defined deficit and could orient her meal planning toward closing it. The clarity was its own kind of comfort. The metrical phenomenon of the late 1950s represents the moment when the decade's diet culture met the post-war food technology industry with results that were simultaneously ridiculous and entirely earnest. Metrical was a meal replacement powder manufactured by Mead Johnson under the supervision of actual nutritional scientists and sold with the clinical authority of a hospital supplement, which in modified form it originally was. The product was developed as a nutritional supplement for hospital patients who could not eat normally, reformulated for weight management use, and introduced to the consumer market in 1959 in a can that looked more like motor oil than food. It was marketed heavily in the 1960s, but the groundwork was laid in the cultural conditions of the late 50s that had established meal replacement as a logically coherent concept. A woman who ate less would weigh less. A product that controlled the exact caloric content of what she consumed provided precision that normal food did not. The can was the equation solution. That it tasted, by most accounts, like chalk dissolved in warm water was a secondary consideration. The emotional texture of 1950s diet culture is perhaps its most revealing dimension, and the one that contemporary commentators most consistently fail to address with any honesty. The women following gelatin diets and counting calories from the metropolitan life tables, and swallowing dexedrine tablets prescribed by physicians who asked relatively few questions, were not, in general, women whose health required it. They were women whose social context demanded it, a social context that had encoded a specific female body shape as the visual marker of a successfully managed feminine life, and that had created a commercial infrastructure to support, profit from, and perpetuate that encoding. The anxiety that drove the diet culture of the 1950s was not primarily an anxiety about health. It was an anxiety about legibility, the fear that a body outside the prescribed parameters communicated something about the woman inside it that would be read as failure, as lack of discipline, as an insufficient commitment to the standards of the world she was trying to inhabit. This anxiety was not created by the women who felt it. It was created for them, with considerable investment of creative and commercial energy, and sold back to them in gelatin packets and reducing tablets and the brisk authority of the metropolitan life tables. The women who were most successfully targeted were the ones who had internalized the creation so thoroughly that they experienced it as a personal shortcoming rather than a manufactured demand. The vitamin supplement industry that was beginning its dramatic expansion in the early 1950s existed in an interesting parallel relationship with the diet culture of the same period, because both operated on the shared premise that the human body's needs could be precisely quantified and then precisely met through the right combination of products. The vitamin pill, specifically the multiple vitamin with minerals that was becoming a daily fixture in the American medicine cabinet, offered women a reassurance that was impossible to provide through food alone. The reassurance that all of the specific, known, precisely numbered nutritional requirements were being met regardless of what any given day's diet had actually delivered. This was comforting in direct proportion to how anxious one already was about one's dietary adequacy, and the 1950s woman, who was simultaneously trying to reduce her caloric intake and maintain the nutritional level required to manage a household, raise children, and present herself as energetic and capable, had considerable occasion for that anxiety. One-a-day vitamins, Geritol with its iron supplement specifically marketed to women with iron deficiency fatigue, and the various B-complex preparations that physicians were recommending for energy. These were the nutritional supplements of the diet culture, the backstop that made the reduction plan feel physiologically safer than reduction alone. The diet column in the 1950s women's magazine was a remarkably stable genre, with a remarkably consistent structure. It opened with a dramatic claim, a specific weight loss achieved in a specific time frame by a specific kind of woman, then provided the week's menu plan in enough detail to constitute a practical guide, then included a testimonial or two from women who had followed the plan and experienced the promised results, and concluded with an encouraging paragraph about how any woman with sufficient determination could achieve the same transformation. The structure was not accidental. It was an editorial formula refined over decades of publication experience about what motivated women to try a new diet plan and what caused them to abandon the previous one. The specific diets changed. The genre's emotional logic was invariant. The promise of a specific result, achieved through a specific method, available to any woman willing to commit. The commitment was the transaction. The result was the aspiration that made the transaction feel worthwhile. Whether any individual woman who followed the column's plan arrived at the promised result was a question the column's editors were not structurally required to track. The social dimension of mid-century diet culture, the way it was practiced not only individually but collectively, through the same friend networks and neighbourhood circles that transmitted every other form of domestic knowledge, meant that information about diet spread through the 1950s female social world with remarkable speed and specificity. A woman who had lost 12 pounds on a particular plan told the women at her Tuesday bridge club, who told the women at their Wednesday church circle, who mentioned it at the Thursday beauty parlour appointments. By the following Saturday, the plan had reached 5 social networks and been modified by each transmission to reflect the transmitter's particular context and experience. This is not unique to the 1950s, of course. It is how useful information has always spread in human social networks. What was specific to the period was the absence of any institutional feedback mechanism, no controlled clinical trial, no registered dietitian reviewing the advice before it circulated, no consumer protection framework requiring that health claims meet any evidential standard. The network was self-organising and self-validating, and the validation it provided was social rather than scientific. If enough women in your immediate circle had lost weight on a plan and reported feeling well, the plan was validated. The science was the testimony. Every Saturday night in 1956, in houses from Levittown, New York to Anaheim, California, a version of the same scene played out. A woman sitting at her vanity mirror with damp hair sectioned into a grid by steel duckbill clips, methodically winding each segment around 2 fingers, sliding those fingers free and anchoring the resulting cylindrical coil to her scalp with a steel pin curl clip that caught with a small definitive click. The damp hair would dry overnight in those coils, reshaped by the mechanics of tension and gravity working together, and Sunday morning would see the same woman removing those clips with practiced speed, loosening the coils with a stiff bristled brush, separating them with her fingers, and arriving at the soft, rolling, precisely directed waves that constituted the decade standard of idealized femininity. The whole cycle, setting on Saturday night, removing on Sunday morning, was as regular and unremarkable as washing dishes. It was simply what you did with hair. The technical foundation of the pin curl lies in the physics of hydrogen bonds within the hair shaft itself. When hair is wet, the hydrogen bonds, which are responsible for the hair's natural shape, are temporarily broken. As the hair dries in a new configuration, constrained by the curl's tension, those hydrogen bonds reform around the new shape. The result is a wave or curl pattern that holds until moisture or heat disrupts the bonds again. 1950s women did not use this language. They knew only that wet hair, wound and pinned and allowed to dry completely, came out curved, and that incompletely dried hair, released too soon, came out both curved and frizzy, which was emphatically not the goal. The goal was control. The goal was always control. Lotion entered the ritual through 2 primary channels: wave-setting lotion, products like Tony Home Permanent Solution, used between permanent treatments to maintain wave definition, or lighter preparations like Helen Curtis Suave Setting Lotion. coated each strand with a thin polymer film that stiffened as it dried and made the resulting wave more durable. The better setting lotions dried completely flexible, producing a wave that moved naturally when the hair was brushed out. The inferior ones produced a crunchy stiffness that required aggressive manipulation to break down, and the manipulation, if too forceful, destroyed the wave pattern it was meant to preserve. This was a technical problem with real social stakes. A woman arriving at church, at a dinner party, at her husband's office, Christmas gathering with hair that moved with appropriate softness, was a woman who had solved the lotion problem correctly. A woman whose hair looked lacquered, stationary, excessively architectural. This communicated something about the management of her household that no one would state directly, but everyone would register. The morning brushing ceremony that followed overnight setting was its own specialized skill set, and women who had mastered it moved through it with the unconscious competence of a virtuoso. The first step was removal. The steel clips came out in a specific order, starting at the front hairline and working backward to prevent disturbance of already released coils. Then a stiff-bristled brush, Mason Pearson's boar bristle brush, if budget allowed, or a less expensive version with nylon bristles if it did not, was drawn through the hair in long sweeping motions that merged adjacent coils into continuous waves. The direction of each brush stroke was predetermined by the original setting pattern. Coils set to roll toward the face produced waves that swept forward. Coils set to roll away produced waves that swept back, and the skilled setter arranged both types in deliberate conversation across the head to produce a pattern of soft motion that looked both structured and spontaneous. This was the great illusion of 1950s hair. It was supposed to appear as if it had simply fallen that way. The 12 hours of architecture beneath the result were not to be acknowledged. The professional alternative to home pin curling was the beauty parlour, and in 1950, America had over 95,000 of them. The beauty parlour was not merely a service establishment. It was a social institution with its own distinct culture, its own vernacular, and its own hours of operation that were understood by the women who used them as a form of scheduled relief from the domestic sphere. You sat under the standing dryer, a pink or aqua dome that descended over your curled head and blew heated air from all directions simultaneously, producing both the drying effect and a pleasant sensation of insulation from the world. And you talked. The conversations that took place in beauty parlours were different in character from conversations that took place anywhere else in a 1950s woman's life. The stylistic intimacy of the space, the fact that everyone was there in a state of productive incompleteness, created a permission structure for a candour that domestic life did not generally accommodate. Beauty parlour conversations about marriage, about money, about the behaviour of children, and the disappointing qualities of husbands. These conversations were held beneath standing dryers, with a frankness that would have been unthinkable at the dinner table. The Tony Home Permanent, introduced in 1948 and refined throughout the early 50s, represented the attempt to bring the beauty parlour's most transformative service directly into the home bathroom, and its success was nothing short of revolutionary for the American beauty industry's understanding of what domestic DIY might accomplish. The kit contained a neutralizer, a setting solution, and a set of plastic rods around which the hair was wound in a process that required significant assistance. Give yourself a Tony, the advertisements instructed with the helpful subtext of the period, or give your best friend one, and the result, when successful, was a wave pattern set at the molecular level rather than merely at the hydrogen bond level. A Tony perm wave lasted months. Pin curl waves lasted until the next morning's humidity. The chemistry was different. The commitment was different. But both rituals, at their root, were expressions of the same 1950s understanding, that hair was not a natural phenomenon that you managed, but an aesthetic argument that you constructed from the inside out every single night. The relationship between the pin curl and the permanent wave, the two dominant hair-shaping technologies of the 1950s, was one of complementarity rather than competition, and women who understood both were working with a level of technical sophistication about hair chemistry that their descendants, with access to professional salon consultations and ingredient listing regulations, sometimes underestimate. The permanent wave, which broke and reformed disulfide bonds in the hair shaft rather than the temporary hydrogen bonds that pin curls manipulated, created a wave pattern that was fundamentally more durable. It persisted through washing, through humidity, through the full range of atmospheric provocations that undid overnight pin curl work in an afternoon. But the permanent was not infinitely flexible in its styling possibilities. Once the disulfide bonds reformed around the rod's shape, the hair was shaped, and reshaping required either a new permanent or the overlay of temporary hydrogen bond styling with pin curls and setting lotion. The two techniques existed, therefore, in practical collaboration. The permanent provided the underlying wave architecture, the weekly pin curl refreshed and directed it. The range of curl pattern available in the pin curl technique was considerably wider than the term's cultural legacy suggests. A tight coil wound close to the scalp and anchored flat produced the small, bouncy ringlet associated with the earlier part of the decade. A larger coil wound around 3 fingers and anchored at a slight upward angle produced a looser, more flowing wave. A long, flat clip curl. A strand of hair twisted flat, accordion folded back on itself and anchored with 2 clips, produced a strong ridge-shaped wave that could be directed with precision. Barrel curls, in which the hair was wound vertically around a pin curl form rather than spiraling flat against the scalp, produced the cylindrical defined curl associated with more glamorous evening styles. A skilled woman working alone at her vanity with only clips, a comb, and a mirror could produce virtually any wave pattern in the 1950s repertoire. The knowledge required was entirely learnable, and it was transmitted through the same channels that transmitted everything else in the domestic knowledge economy of the period: mother to daughter, neighbour to neighbour, beauty parlour stylist to loyal customer. The social geography of the beauty parlour deserves extended attention, because the institution was significantly more important to the decade's female culture than its nominal function as a hair maintenance service would suggest. The standing appointment, whether weekly or fortnightly, structured women's time in a way that had few parallels in the domestic routine. Unlike grocery shopping or laundry or meal preparation, the beauty parlour appointment was not interruptible and not deprioritizable. Once the setting lotion was in your hair and the pin curls were set and you were under the dryer, you could not realistically be called upon to answer the telephone or tend to a child or respond to the domestic emergency of the moment. You were, in the most physically complete sense available in the 1950s domestic life, elsewhere. The 45 minutes to an hour under the dryer was not exactly private. There were 3 other women under adjacent dryers, and the conversation that drifted between them was a significant part of the experience. But it was a different category of social experience than the constant, accountable availability that domestic life generally required. The brush-out itself, the morning ceremony that transformed the overnight pin curl work into the soft, directed wave that would carry a woman through her day, had a particular quality that women of the period described in terms that suggest it was emotionally as well as practically significant. There was a specific moment in the brush-out process, roughly 3/4 of the way through, when enough coils had been loosened and merged that the overall shape of the style was visible but not yet fully realised, at which the result revealed itself. Either the wave was going where it was supposed to go, or it was not. A well-set head of hair brushed out with the satisfying inevitability of a plan executing correctly. The waves fell into place, each one directing the next, the volume distributing itself evenly from roots to ends. A poorly set head required intervention, additional brushing at the resistant sections, strategic manipulation with the hand, occasionally the defeat of the pintail comb applied to create a wave that the setting had failed to produce independently. The experienced woman knew immediately which of these mornings she was having. The hair told her within the first 30 seconds. This kind of intimate, accumulated knowledge about the behaviour of one's own hair under specific atmospheric conditions, with specific products, after different amounts of drying time. This was expertise in the fullest sense of the word, acquired through years of practice and nowhere formally taught or recognised. Setting lotion technology evolved meaningfully across the decade, tracking the broader trajectory of polymer chemistry that was reshaping American consumer products in the post-war industrial boom. Early setting lotions were essentially diluted gum tragacanth, a natural plant-derived thickener that had been used in pharmacy and cosmetics for decades, mixed with water and a small amount of perfume. They worked adequately, they dried to a slight tackiness that some women found acceptable and others did not, and they produced a wave that lasted through the day under favourable conditions. By the mid-1950s, synthetic polymers had entered the formulation. Polyvinyl pyrrolidone, which appeared in wave sets and hairsprays under a range of trade names, was the breakthrough ingredient, providing a flexible, clear film that held the hair's shape without stiffness, and, crucially, without humidity absorption. Hair that had been set with the older gum-based lotions could revert to its natural state in humid weather with frustrating speed. Hair set with the new polymer formulas was considerably more resistant to the humidity that every August morning in the American Northeast seemed specifically designed to deliver. This was not a minor quality of life improvement in the context of a life organised around the daily production of a specific hair appearance. In 1951, the Patricia Stevens Courier College for Women in Chicago distributed a brochure to prospective students that listed, under the heading "What Our Graduates Know," a catalogue of accomplishments so specific and so detailed that it reads today as something between a theatrical script and a technical manual. Graduates knew, according to this document, how to enter a room, specifically how to pause at the threshold for 2 seconds before advancing, allowing the room to register their arrival without the awkward staging of a maid entrance. They knew how to seat themselves in a chair, lower the body by bending the knees rather than leaning forward, contact the back of the chair with the back of the thighs before allowing the spine to relax, cross the ankles rather than the knees in mixed company. They knew how to introduce a stranger to a group, state the newcomer's name first, followed by the names of the assembled, moving from left to right, pausing at each name to allow eye contact to be made. The brochure filled 8 pages. The college's enrolment in 1951 was over 300 women. The finishing school, in its mid-century American incarnation, occupying a significant distance from its European aristocratic origins, was less about the transmission of class markers from one generation to the next than it was about the production of a particular kind of functional social confidence. The European model assumed that its students already possessed the social standing that etiquette was meant to mark. The American charm school assumed no such thing, and this democratic premise was, paradoxically, what made it so commercially successful. Patricia Stevens, John Robert Powers, the Helena Rubinstein-affiliated finishing programs, the Barbizon School of Modelling. These institutions operated on the explicit premise that charm was learnable, that poise was a skill rather than a birthright, and that any woman, regardless of her background, could acquire the behavioural vocabulary that allowed her to move through the social world with the frictionless ease that the era's middle-class aspirations required. The posture work was the foundation upon which everything else was built, and it was substantially more sophisticated than the famous book balancing exercise that popular memory has preserved as its primary visual artifact. Yes, books were balanced on heads. A weighted textbook placed crown centre was a reliable, immediate corrective for the forward head posture and rounded shoulders that poor posture habits produced. But the deeper work was anatomical. Students were taught to identify the feeling of correct spinal alignment from the inside, the sensation of the lumbar curve's natural inward arch, the positioning of the shoulder blades down and back rather than elevated and forward, the relaxed placement of the chin parallel to the floor rather than jutting forward or tucking down. The book on the head was a feedback device, not a party trick. Remove the book, and the instructor's goal was for the student to retain the alignment through learned proprioception. Many students found, to their surprise, that correct posture made them taller by a half inch or more, a physical reality, since slumped spines genuinely compress vertical height, and this discovery was routinely cited in students' testimonials as one of the program's most dramatic benefits. The grammar of parlour room introductions was an entire discipline in its own right, governed by a hierarchy so specific that it required instruction to navigate reliably. Age took precedence. The younger person was always introduced to the older, which meant you said the older person's name first. Mrs. Whitfield, may I present Miss Carter, placing the younger person in the position of the one presenting herself, which was understood as the deferential posture. Professional rank mediated when ages were unclear or approximate. You introduced a civilian to a military officer, a layperson to a member of the clergy, a student to a teacher. Gender further complicated the matrix. In social settings, men were introduced to women rather than women to men, placing women in the position of the socially honoured party to whom the introduction was being made. A situation involving an elderly male professor, a young female senator, and a middle-aged military chaplain of indeterminate rank could produce a genuine protocological impasse, and etiquette teachers dealt with this by noting that any reasonable decision made with clear intention and completed gracefully was preferable to the hesitation and confusion that an attempt at perfect protocol might produce. Confidence of execution in 1952 was itself a kind of etiquette. Conversational boundaries were mapped with equal precision, and the territory they excluded was remarkably wide. At a first meeting, a dinner party, a neighbourhood gathering, a professional reception, the appropriate topics were the host's home and its decor, admired and never criticised, the season and any pleasant outdoor activities it suggested, current popular entertainment of the uncontroversial variety, general observations about travel, aspirational rather than comparative, and compliments on the appearance of other guests, phrased as observations rather than evaluations. Explicitly excluded from first meeting conversation, income, family conflicts, medical conditions, the cost of any item, political opinions of any specificity, religious practice, and what one etiquette guide of the period called domestic difficulties, a phrase whose diplomatic vagueness covered an enormous range of material that women were, in practice, holding in careful reserve until they reached the beauty parlour. The reasoning behind these restrictions was not merely social discomfort avoidance. It was a theory of relationship building that held that trust was earned through demonstrated good judgment, and that good judgment was demonstrated first by showing you could talk for an entire evening without saying anything that made anyone uncomfortable. The modern inheritor of the charm school tradition is not, as one might assume, the etiquette columnist or the corporate image consultant, though both represent partial lineages. The truest descendant is the executive presence coaching industry, which now charges considerably more than a Patricia Stevens tuition for essentially the same package of proprioception training, conversational strategy, and room entry mechanics, delivered not to young women preparing for social life, but to mid-career professionals preparing for boardrooms. The content has shifted. The underlying premise that social behaviour is a learnable performance with quantifiable outcomes has not moved at all. What has changed is the vocabulary we use to describe the performance. In 1951, it was charm. In the current moment, it is executive presence. The book has left the head. The alignment it was tracking never did. The physical environment in which charm school instruction was delivered was itself a carefully constructed pedagogical tool, and the schools that understood this most clearly produced the most lasting impressions on their students. The Patricia Stevens and Powers schools occupied premises designed to communicate, through every detail of their physical presentation, the social world that their curriculum was intended to equip students to navigate. Clean carpet, coordinated furnishings, natural light managed through drapes rather than blinds, fresh flowers in cut glass vases. These were not incidental to the educational experience, but continuous with it. The implicit instruction, communicated before a single lesson had been delivered was, "This is what a properly maintained environment looks like. You are developing an eye for it. You will apply this eye to every space you occupy and every space you create for others." The posture work that occupied the first weeks of most charm school curricula was physically demanding in ways that women who enrolled expecting a series of pleasant social lessons were sometimes surprised to discover. Correct posture, as the schools taught it, required the retraining of muscular habit patterns that in many students had been set over years or decades of habitual misalignment. The forward head posture, in which the skull sits forward of the body's centre of gravity, placing compensatory tension on the neck and upper back muscles, was the most common target, and correcting it meant, in practical terms, learning to feel normal in a position that initially felt artificially upright. The shoulder blade down and back instruction required the activation of lower trapezius fibres that many students had never deliberately engaged. The neutral pelvis requirement meant releasing the habitual anterior pelvic tilt that closed footwear and sedentary domestic postures tended to produce. None of this was painful, but all of it was unfamiliar, and the combination of muscular unfamiliarity with the book-balancing feedback mechanism made for a challenging first 2 weeks that separated the students who had genuinely committed to the curriculum from those who had enrolled primarily for the social cachet of the institution. Beyond posture, the curriculum dedicated substantial attention to the mechanics of social movement, how to enter and exit vehicles, how to traverse a staircase, how to move through a crowded room. Each of these activities has a mechanical logic that is invisible to observers when executed correctly, and jarringly visible when executed poorly, and the schools were explicit about this asymmetry. Ascending a staircase while maintaining the erect spine and square shoulders required specific adjustments to the placement of the foot, leading with the ball of the foot rather than the heel, keeping the knee tracking over the second toe to prevent the inward collapse that generated an awkward visual line that most women had never consciously considered. Descending required additional attention to the control of forward momentum, specifically the resistance of the natural impulse to lean forward as the body's centre of gravity shifted over the descending foot. These were not trivial observations. Anyone who has watched a person descend a staircase in a state of physical self-awareness will recognise the difference between movement that is confident and movement that is managed, and the school's goal was to convert managed into confident through repetition. The conversational training covered by charm school curricula extended into territory that overlapped significantly with what we would now call social psychology, the study of conversational dynamics, of listening behaviour, of the non-verbal signals that communicated engagement or dismissal. A significant portion of the conversational instruction was, in essence, active listening training. Students were taught to orient the body toward the person speaking, to maintain eye contact at the level that communicated attention without aggression, which the curriculum quantified as approximately 60 to 70% of available eye contact time, and to respond in ways that demonstrated specific comprehension of what had been said rather than generic acknowledgement of the speakings having occurred. How interesting was insufficient. What a remarkable point about the theatre season was better. I hadn't thought about the implications you're describing for next season's programme. Do you attend the subscription series? Was ideal. The ideal response demonstrated that you had heard the specific content, found it worth engaging with, and were continuing the thread rather than redirecting to your own experience. This was, and remains, a more sophisticated conversational skill than most people ever deliberately develop. The curriculum's treatment of written communication, the handwritten note, the formal letter, the thank you correspondence, reflected an era in which written social correspondence carried significant social weight and followed conventions that were as codified as anything else in the etiquette system. Thank you notes for dinner invitations were to be written within 48 hours of the event, on proper stationery, cream or white, no patterns, no coloured inks, and were to contain 3 specific elements: a specific reference to something that made the evening memorable, an expression of the pleasure the evening had provided, and a forward-looking gesture toward future reciprocity. The note was not to be longer than a single page of standard notepaper. Brevity was its own form of elegance, and was to be handwritten rather than typed, since the typewritten social note communicated the wrong relationship between effort and regard. The pen used mattered, blue or black ink only. Green ink for social correspondence was considered an eccentricity, tolerated in established figures with sufficient cultural capital to support it. In a student, it was simply incorrect. The lasting legacy of the charm school in American culture is not the specific content of its curriculum. The book balanced posture correction, the protocol of staircase ascent, the 48-hour thank you note, but the underlying premise that social competence is a learnable set of skills rather than an inherited disposition. This premise was, in the 1950s, both genuinely democratic and genuinely limiting. Democratic because it offered upward social mobility to women of any background willing to invest the time and tuition, limiting because it required those women to adopt a single, class-specific set of behavioral norms as the universal standard. The charm school produced women who moved through certain social worlds with frictionless grace. It produced that grace by teaching them to navigate the specific geography of those worlds and no others. The grace was real, the geography was narrow, and the awareness of that narrowness was precisely what the curriculum wisely never addressed. In 1954, a woman named Eleanor Meade of Westchester County, New York, owned 47 powder compacts. She kept them in a flat mahogany case lined with grey velvet, arranged in rows by size, and she opened the case approximately once a week to rotate which compact she was currently carrying in her handbag and to assess the condition of her collection. Her compacts range from a tiny silver Art Deco piece inherited from her mother, no larger than a 50-cent coin and engraved with an elaborate leaf motif, to a recent acquisition from Saks Fifth Avenue. A Stratton compact in gold-plated brass with an enamel lid depicting a bluebird on a flowering branch, purchased for $3.95. Mrs. Meade was not, by the standards of her social circle, an unusual woman. She was described, when she was described at all, as a woman who took care of herself. The 47 compacts were part of what taking care of yourself looked like in 1954. The powder compact as a collectible object occupies one of those fascinating intersections in material culture history where utility and desire become so thoroughly fused that neither can be separated from the other without destroying both. At its most basic, the compact was a functional object, a small hinge case containing a mirror, a powder cake, and a puff, designed to allow a woman to check and adjust her face powder in public settings without retreating to a restroom. But the physical form that function required, something small enough to carry in a handbag, rigid enough to protect the mirror and powder from the compressions and collisions of daily transport, with a closure mechanism secure enough to prevent powder disaster, but easy enough to operate with one hand while holding a cocktail glass, was, it turned out, an elegant design problem, and elegant design problems, given sufficient material wealth and manufacturing ingenuity, tend to produce beautiful objects. Stratton of England, the Birmingham-based manufacturer whose products dominated the British and American markets through the 1940s and 50s, understood this with particular clarity. Their patent-pending self-opening mechanism, which released the compact's lid and rotated it to a stable open position with a single thumb press on a small button, allowing the mirror to be exposed without fumbling, was a genuine functional innovation, and Stratton used it as the foundation for a product line that treated the compact's external surface as a canvas. Enamel lids depicting pastoral scenes, floral arrangements, pastoral chinoiserie, theatrical masks, birds, butterflies, and abstract geometric designs in the style of contemporary abstract painting were produced in limited seasonal runs, which created both the sense of seasonal refreshment and the logic of collection. Last season's bluebird was not this season's peacock, and a woman who appreciated beautiful things might reasonably want both. Stratton compacts were retailed at department store cosmetics counters, but they were displayed at jewellery counter standards, under glass on velvet in ordered rows that communicated the seriousness of the investment they represented. The cultural weight of the compact in a woman's handbag was partly about beauty maintenance, and partly about something more precise, the public performance of feminine competence. The ritual of checking one's powder in public was governed by an etiquette so specific it occupied multiple paragraphs in every social guidebook of the period. A woman might open her compact at a restaurant table, briefly, after the meal before the conversation resumed, but not during the meal itself, and never in a setting where the intimacy of the act would be visible to people outside her immediate party. The mirror was for the woman's assessment of herself, not for the entertainment or observation of others. The puff was applied with brief, patting motions rather than sweeping ones, to avoid creating the appearance of foundation application, which was a more intimate act that belonged in private. The compact was then closed with a sound, that small definitive click of the mechanism that communicated conclusion, readiness, and the willingness to re-engage with the world. It was a very small ceremony. It carried considerable social weight. Powder formulas of the period were remarkably diverse in their composition and aspirations. Coty's Airspun, whose translucent formula, an iconic spinning wheel package, had been on the market since the early 30s, remained the essential setting powder, the finishing layer that locked foundation in place and muted any residual shine. Lady Esther's four-purpose face cream powder was a hybrid product, a compressed combination of cold cream and powder that performed a version of both functions simultaneously and appealed enormously to the woman who found the multiple-step process excessive. Revlon's powder in the Touch and Glow range came in a wide array of shades organised by undertone, pink-based for fair complexions, golden-based for medium ones, deeper warm tones for olive skins, a shade range that by the standards of the 1950s was considered generous and inclusive, though it remained entirely organised around the assumption that the customer was a woman of European descent. The compact that held these powders could be inexpensive and purely functional, or it could be an object of such careful manufacturing that it outlasted not only the powder it originally contained, but the skin it had been designed to tend. The vintage compact collector community that exists today, active at specialised antique fairs, online auction platforms, and dedicated collector societies in both the United States and the United Kingdom, is the delayed flowering of exactly the impulse that Eleanor Mead housed in her mahogany case in Westchester County. The objects these collectors seek are not primarily investments. They are evidence. They are physical records of a time when a woman's relationship with her own face was conducted through a series of deliberate material choices, each of which said something about who she was and what she valued. A Stratton compact with an enamel bluebird, purchased in 1954, used until 1960, and then placed in a drawer where it sat undisturbed for 6 decades, arrives at an auction table carrying all of that history in its surface scratches and its dried powder residue, and the particular way its mechanism clicks open. You press the button, and something from 1954 opens in your hand. That is not merely antique. That is time, made tangible. The manufacturing geography of the compact trade in the 1950s was considerably more complex than a consumer standing at a department store cosmetics counter would have had reason to guess. American compact manufacturers, Volupte, Evans, Elgin American, Wadsworth, produced a range of pieces that served the mass market, from the simple chrome compact available at Woolworths for 69 cents to the more elaborate gilded and enamelled pieces that occupied the middle market. But the most collectible pieces of the period were predominantly European: Stratton from Birmingham, Kigu from London, Schildknecht from Germany, and a range of French ateliers whose pieces circulated through high-end department stores like Bergdorf Goodman and Neiman Marcus, and whose names, many of them small family operations, never achieved the brand recognition of their American counterparts, despite the superiority of their craftsmanship. The distinction between a mass market and luxury compact in the 1950s was legible in several physical properties simultaneously. Weight was the first indicator. A quality compact had a density and solidity in the hand that distinguished it immediately from the lighter, gauge metal of economy production. The hinge mechanism was the second. A well-made hinge open to a specific stopping point with the kind of damped precision that suggests engineering, while a cheap hinge either swung free or caught unpredictably. The mirror was the third and most telling element. A quality compact mirror was optically flat, producing a true reflection without the slight distortion that inexpensive stamped mirrors introduced, and it was held in its case by a frame that had been carefully sized to prevent rattling. A rattling mirror in a compact was the acoustic equivalent of a scuff on a shoe, an evidence of economy that announced itself at the worst possible moment. The powder formulas themselves were, throughout the 50s, evolving in ways that affected both the performance of the compact and the habits of the women using them. Early decade powders tended toward higher levels of talc, which provided excellent slip and a smooth application, but settled quickly into pores and creases and required more frequent touch-ups. As the decade progressed, formulations incorporating finer milled Mia particles, which provided luminosity through their capacity to reflect light, began appearing in department store brands, offering a finish that held longer and photographed more attractively under the flashbulb photography that was now a feature of social events at every level of American life. The camera, specifically the amateur camera that was appearing in domestic and social settings with increasing frequency through the decade, was creating new demands on cosmetic performance. A finish that looked matte and refined under natural light might appear chalky and flat in a flash photograph, a problem that mica-based formulas addressed by maintaining enough luminosity to register on film without looking theatrical in person. The etiquette of powder application in public was embedded within the broader question of which personal maintenance activities were permissible in which social contexts, and the 1950s answer to this question was more permissive about the compact and less permissive about everything else. A woman could open her compact, press her puff briefly against her T-zone and cheeks, examine her reflection for 3 to 5 seconds, and close the compact again at a restaurant table between courses, at a theatre in the interval, at a cocktail party when there was a natural pause in conversation. She could not, in those same contexts, apply lipstick, which was a more intimate act that implied a more significant restoration rather than a maintenance touch-up and belonged in the powder room. She could not produce a hairbrush or comb. She could not adjust her brassiere strap or her stocking seam in any visible way. The compact occupied a uniquely privileged position in the taxonomy of permitted public self-maintenance, and the compactness that gave it its name was precisely what enabled that privilege. The smallness and the speed and the self-contained completeness of the ritual made it brief enough to occur without commandeering a social interaction. The psychological weight that the compact carried in a woman's handbag was related to, but distinct from the psychological weight of the cosmetics it contained. The compact was an object of ownership in a period when married women's property rights were substantially curtailed by both law and custom. Most states maintained versions of coverture law that made a married woman's property legally her husband's, and the objects a woman owned in the full, unqualified sense were therefore more emotionally significant than their monetary value suggested. The contents of a woman's handbag were hers. The compact was hers. The mirror in the compact showed her face to her, privately, in a moment that no one else shared. This small private mirror, in a culture that otherwise presented a woman's appearance as primarily a matter of public concern and evaluation, was the one moment of the day when she assessed herself for herself. Whether what she found there met her own standards, rather than someone else's, was between her and the optically flat glass. The compact closed. The click was private. Whatever she had seen in those 3 to 5 seconds stayed with her. The transition from the loose powder compact to the pressed powder compact, which occurred gradually through the decade and was substantially complete by 1960, was driven by a combination of factors that included product formulation improvements, manufacturing economics, and the changing patterns of women's daily lives. Loose powder required a puff that created a cloud of particulated application, which was acceptable in a private vanity setting and acceptable, with care, in a brief public touch-up. But the expanding professional presence of women in offices, in boardrooms, in the public spaces that their post-war economic participation was opening to them, created demand for a product that could be used with complete discretion, that would not dust the shoulder of a dark suit jacket with pale powder residue, that could be pressed directly to the skin without a visible cloud of product floating between the applicator and the person across the desk. Pressed powder addressed all of these requirements. It required no puff to sift loose product. It applied directly from the cake to the skin, and its slightly higher proportion of binding agents to talc meant a more controlled release of product with each application. The compact that held it became, in the process, a slightly less beautiful but considerably more practical object. The trade was, in the 1960s world into which women were moving, worth making. On the evening of October the 19th, 1958, Barbara Haskell of Shaker Heights, Ohio, threw a dinner party for 8 that she had been preparing for 11 days. The guest list included her husband's division manager and his wife, 2 couples from their church congregation, who were loosely but importantly in competition with one another in the local social hierarchy, and a younger couple who were known to be charming in mixed company, and whose presence would prevent the evening from becoming too rigidly formal. The menu had been finalised on a Tuesday after consultation with the current issue of Better Homes and Gardens and a telephone conversation with her friend Margaret, who had successfully executed a very similar menu for her husband's colleagues in September. The bar cart was arranged by Thursday. By Saturday, Barbara Haskell had rehearsed the conversational transition from appetizers to first course to the point where it felt, to her, like something she was competent to execute without visible effort. On Sunday, 11 days after she began, she put on her hostess gown and opened the front door and performed the whole thing in 3 hours and 40 minutes without a single identifiable error. Her husband told her later that the evening had gone very well. The mid-century suburban dinner party was a social institution so precisely engineered that examining its mechanics reveals the decade's deeper anxieties about status, gender, and the management of impression, with a clarity that more obviously political documents sometimes obscure. The post-war suburban home, newly built, freshly furnished on credit, equipped with a full range of modern appliances from the refrigerator to the Mixmaster stand mixer to the electric carving knife, was simultaneously a domestic sanctuary and a social advertisement. When guests arrived, they were not merely visiting a family, they were auditing a household. The state of the carpets, the quality of the crystal glassware, the sophistication of the hors d'oeuvres, the conversational range of the hostess. All of these details were processed and filed and later discussed in other living rooms by other couples who had been making exactly the same calculations about their own households. In this context, the dinner party was not entertainment. It was a quarterly performance review, issued and received simultaneously by everyone present. The bar cart occupied a position of particular social importance in this performance. The proper stocking of a 1950s bar cart for a dinner party of 8 required an understanding of the prevailing cocktail culture that was specific to the period and the demographic. Whiskey, specifically Scotch whiskey from established distillers, or American rye or bourbon, was the serious man's drink, served in heavy crystal lowball glasses with a specific amount of ice. 2 cubes, not crushed. Crushed ice was for casual occasions. Gin appeared primarily in martinis, which were mixed in a specific ratio, anywhere from 3:1 to 6:1 gin to dry vermouth, depending on the host's preference, shaken or stirred as a matter of passionate, irrationally held conviction, served in chilled conical glasses that had been stored in the freezer for at least 20 minutes. The olive or the twist was a statement of aesthetic philosophy. Bourbon was mixed into old fashions for those of a more traditional temperament, or served neat for those who preferred to demonstrate their seriousness. For the women in the party, a range of softer options was generally available. A whiskey sour, a Tom Collins, wine if the hosts were of a cosmopolitan inclination, or the sherry that was almost universally offered as an aperitif regardless of whether anyone particularly wanted it, because sherry was what refined households offered before dinner, and the appearance of refinement was the point of the exercise. The deviled egg was the decade's perfect party food, and its ubiquity on mid-century entertaining tables was not accidental. It was practical. Eggs were inexpensive, the recipe scaled reliably, the preparation could be completed hours in advance. But it also carried a specific social signal. A deviled egg required technique. The yolks had to be smoothly mashed, the filling piped, or at minimum spooned with a steady hand into a uniform mound. The paprika dusted on top in an even decorative layer. A hostess who served beautiful deviled eggs was demonstrating that she had the time, the equipment, the skill, and the attention to detail to produce a small, perfect thing, repeated 16 times with consistency. This was not the ostentatious luxury of an expensive ingredient. It was the more specifically feminine luxury of invisible labour deployed with expert results. A table that featured beautiful deviled eggs also featured a woman who had been in her kitchen for longer than anyone would know, and who had arranged things so that this fact was entirely invisible. The geometry of crystal glassware on a properly set 1950s dinner table was its own language. The water goblet sat above the knife at the 10 o'clock position from the plate. The wine glass, if wine was served, was positioned to the right and slightly forward of the water goblet. In households with aspirations to formal European entertaining, a separate glass for white wine and for red wine might both be present, positioned in the sequence in which they would be used. The napkins were linen, pressed flat, folded into rectangles or, for the most adventurous hostesses, arranged into fan folds in the wine glasses, a technique demonstrated in every entertaining magazine of the period, with such frequency that its execution became a kind of baseline competence requirement. The specific weight and transparency of good crystal, Waterford if the budget stretched to it, Fostoria or Cambridge glass if it did not, caught the dining room light and threw small rainbows onto the tablecloth that were, in the aesthetic logic of the 1950s, evidence of prosperity and taste. Light and crystal was the optical proof that you had arrived somewhere worth being. The flow of conversation through a dinner party of this period was managed as carefully as the flow of courses, and the hostess was primarily responsible for the management. She was the social traffic director. She introduced topics, redirected when a topic became too contentious, drew out the quieter guests with direct questions, gently abbreviated the monologues of the dominant ones, and maintained the general temperature of the room at the specific setting that the period called animated but comfortable. This was an elaborate and genuinely skilled performance, and the women who did it well were quietly, persistently, and almost entirely unacknowledged as performers of a complex social art. They were simply described as wonderful hostesses. Their husbands were described as very lucky men. The distinction between those two descriptions contains, if you look at it long enough, the whole of a particular moment in American social history. The bar cart's role in mid-century entertaining extended beyond its function, as a drink service station, into something closer to a piece of domestic theatre, and the care that thoughtful hosts invested in its arrangement reflects how clearly the period understood decoration as communication. The decanter set, cut crystal decanters, each filled with a different spirit at the beginning of the evening, each identified by a small silver decanter tag on a chain, was the bar cart's central architectural element, and its logic was simultaneously practical. Guests could help themselves, in the household with a sufficiently relaxed attitude towards self-service, and demonstrative, the quantity and variety of spirits decanted was a direct index of the household's social investment. A bar cart with a single decanter and a handful of mismatched glasses told a different story than a bar cart with 4 matched crystal decanters, a champagne bucket with ice, and a complete service of heavy-bottomed glasses sorted by type. The bar cart was a social inventory, visible to every guest who entered the room. The ice question was, in the 1950s, a genuinely logistical challenge that the advent of the automatic ice maker had not yet resolved for most American households. Home freezers of the period produced ice cubes slowly and in limited quantity, using ice trays that required manual filling and a certain amount of advanced planning. A dinner party for 8 that planned to serve cocktails for 45 minutes to an hour before dinner required a quantity of ice that the household's own freezer could not reliably produce, which meant that serious entertainers either purchased block ice and chipped it at home, a practice that required a specific set of tools and technique, or, more commonly, telephoned their grocer or the local ice delivery service in advance and arranged for cubed ice to be delivered on the afternoon of the party and kept in a large metal tub in the garage or on the back porch until needed. The ice bucket that sat on the bar cart was therefore the final station in a logistical process that had begun days earlier, and the condensation ring it left on the silver tray beneath it was the evening's evidence of forethought. The question of what music played during a 1950s dinner party is not trivial, because the sonic environment of the evening was as deliberately managed as any other element of the hostess's production. High-fidelity stereophonic record players had become accessible to the middle-class household by the mid-decade. The hi-fi set, with its separate turntable, amplifier and speaker components arrayed with some ceremony in the living room, was both a piece of functional equipment and an aesthetic statement about the household's cultural aspirations. The record collection displayed in its racks beside the hi-fi communicated taste and range. For a dinner party, the selection required careful calibration, something sophisticated enough to communicate cultural awareness without being so challenging or attention-demanding that it competed with conversation. Easy listening orchestral recordings, the Nelson Riddle arrangements that accompanied Frank Sinatra's Capitol Records period, the Henry Mancini soundtrack albums, the lush string arrangements that the London Philharmonic was producing for American labels, occupied this niche perfectly. They provided a harmonic bed that lifted the evening's atmosphere without ever demanding to be listened to, which was precisely the kind of invisible competence that 1950s entertaining most admired. The deviled egg was not the only finger food that occupied the hors d'oeuvres tray, but its companions were chosen according to a similar logic of skilled simplicity. Stuffed celery, the ribs filled with a cream cheese mixture and cut into precise 2-inch lengths, required a mandolin-level consistency of cut that demonstrated the hostess's willingness to execute even the smallest detail to a standard. Canapés on toast rounds topped with anchovy paste or herbed cream cheese or a small wafer of smoked salmon required the toast rounds themselves to be cut in neat circles with a biscuit cutter and toasted to a uniform golden brown. A task that was entirely mechanical, but that benefited from the kind of patient attention that distinguished a carefully executed hors d'oeuvres tray from a merely assembled one. The placement of these items on the serving tray was its own consideration. The tray was not a storage surface, but a composed object, and the arrangement of colours and forms on it, red pimento stuffed olives alternating with pale celery and cream-coloured canapés in a pattern with visual rhythm, was evaluated by the arriving guests with exactly the discernment that the hostess had anticipated when she made the arrangement. The dinner party's emotional climax was, paradoxically, not the dinner itself, but the moment roughly 20 minutes after dessert was cleared, when the conversation had deepened and loosened under the combined influence of 2 or 3 hours of social engagement, excellent food, and the wine or liqueurs that the host had been careful not to over-provide. This was the moment at which the party either achieved something, a genuine exchange, a real laugh, an unexpected connection between 2 guests who had not previously met, or subsided into the polite, dispersed conversations that preceded the first guest's departure. A skilled hostess could facilitate the former and prevent the latter through a number of techniques that the entertaining literature of the period described in considerable detail. The precisely timed introduction of coffee and dessert that broke the after-dinner lull. The conversational topic floated into the room like a kite string. Something genuinely interesting, slightly surprising, just provocative enough to invite a range of responses. The ability to do this well was not universally distributed, and the households in which it occurred were talked about long afterward, in terms that attributed the evening's success to some ineffable quality of the home itself or the company assembled, rather than to the 12 days of planning and the Tuesday night rehearsal of conversational segues, which was, of course, exactly how Barbara Haskell of Shaker Heights would have preferred it. In 1955, the fashion editor Eugenia Shepherd wrote a column for the New York Herald Tribune, in which she made a claim that struck many of her readers as either self-evident or alarming, depending entirely on their wardrobe. "A woman who is incorrectly dressed," she wrote, "has made a statement she cannot retract." The column concerned the specific question of appropriate daytime attire for luncheon engagements in Manhattan, but the principle Shepherd was articulating was considerably broader. In the mid-1950s, clothing was understood by virtually everyone across every stratum of American social life that had pretensions to respectability. As a moral category, as much as an aesthetic one, correctness in dress was not a matter of personal expression, or creative freedom, or individualistic self-declaration. It was a matter of demonstrating that you understood the rules of the world you inhabited and intended to comply with them. The architecture of a fully correct 1955 female outfit began, invisibly, at the foundation. The foundation garment, specifically the long-line brassiere and the panty girdle, or in some cases, the all-in-one corselet that combined both into a single structured panel, was not optional in the 1950s wardrobe in any meaningful sense of the term. The silhouette that the decade's clothing was designed to hang from required it, and the pushed-up, rounded bust that the structured brassiere created, the smooth, uninterrupted line from waist to upper thigh that the girdle's compressed panels produced, the elimination of any visible body contour that departed from the prescribed hourglass geometry. Foundations of the period were engineering objects. Warner's, Maidenform, Playtex and Formfit competed in a market where the criteria for success were specific and measurable. The garment had to create the correct shape, stay in place through the full range of daily movement, and leave no visible evidence of its own presence beneath the outer clothing. A panty girdle line visible through a slim skirt was a social failure of the first order. A brassiere strap visible at the shoulder, even a quarter of an inch of white strap, was worse. Over the foundation went the slip, which was not a token layer but a structural one. Taffeta or nylon slips in the early 50s, satin in more formal contexts, they served the mechanical function of protecting the outer garment's lining from body oils and perspiration. Foundation garments were not designed for breathability, and the visual function of providing the outer skirt's fabric with a smooth, unencumbered surface to fall from. A good slip moved with the wearer, adding a very slight weighted pendulum quality to a full skirt swing that improved both the visual line and the sensory experience of wearing it. Then the dress itself, or the blouse and skirt combination, or the suit. The structured wool suit with its padded shoulders and nipped waist was the decade's foremost daytime professional garment, equally appropriate for office work, in the minority of women who occupied offices in 1955, and for shopping, luncheon and social engagements of moderate formality. Then the petticoat, if the skirt was full, stiffened nylon net in multiple layers, each layer adding volume and movement in a way that was deeply satisfying to the physical experience of movement in the decade's clothing. A full skirt without a petticoat was like a stage set without lighting. Technically present, but missing the element that made it comprehensible as spectacle. The glove question was among the most specifically regulated in the entire mid-50s wardrobe code, and its regulations reflected the period's meticulous attention to the calibration of formality across different contexts. White cotton gloves, known as day gloves, were required for church attendance, for visits to any venue of civic or cultural importance, and for any social engagement that occurred in a private home. Their length was specified, short, ending just at or slightly above the wrist. They were washed after each wearing, since cotton absorbs and retains perspiration and the staining it produces, and a pair of day gloves worn twice between washings communicated to the observant eye a carelessness about personal presentation that extended by the logic of the period to every other aspect of one's character. For afternoon tea and formal social calls, longer gloves, reaching the middle of the forearm, were appropriate, the length scaling with the formality of the occasion. For evening events, opera-length gloves in white or ivory kid leather were the standard, reaching to the upper arm in a line unbroken by any jewellery except, possibly, a bracelet worn over the glove rather than underneath it. The rule about rings worn under gloves was absolute. You did not wear rings under gloves. The glove was the outermost statement. It did not exist to conceal other statements. Daytime shoes and evening shoes occupied different taxonomic kingdoms in the 1950s wardrobe, and the border between those kingdoms was not fuzzy. The court shoe, a closed-toe, low-vamp pump in a moderate to high heel, was the decade's standard daytime shoe, available from Naturalizer, Red Cross shoes, and the department storehouse brands in a range of colours that were expected to coordinate with the wearer's outer garment, or at least refrain from contradicting it. The heel height of the daytime pump was regulated not by fashion but by occasion. A 2-inch heel was appropriate for morning errands. 2.5 to 3 inches was correct for afternoon engagements. Anything higher than 3 inches, except on special occasions, read as either theatrical or unprofessionally seductive, both of which were categories that the decade's social code was extremely motivated to distinguish from appropriate. Evening shoes could be more adventurous, satin dyed to match the gown, rhinestone-encrusted kitten heels, gilded leather in the gold and silver that daytime sensibility absolutely prohibited. What the 1955 wardrobe decree system produced, at its most successfully achieved, was a form of female appearance so highly regulated and so internally consistent that its individual components could be assembled or disassembled with a precision that we now associate primarily with military uniforms. The woman who dressed correctly for every occasion of a 1955 social week was performing a continuous act of social literacy, demonstrating in every clothing choice that she had correctly read the social context she was about to enter and prepared herself accordingly. The act of getting dressed was, in this framework, an act of respect for the social world, the statement that you had taken its codes seriously enough to master them and were now performing that mastery for the benefit of everyone present. The irony, which certain women of the period were privately and acutely aware of, was that the more perfectly you executed this performance, the more completely invisible the effort became. The perfectly dressed woman looked, to the casual observer, as if she had simply appeared, correct and complete, without any process at all. The crinoline and petticoat beneath the full skirts of the mid-decade silhouette represent perhaps the most physically significant element of the 1950s wardrobe, not because of their visual contribution, though that was substantial, but because of their physical presence in the wearer's life. A full-skirted 1955 day dress, worn over the appropriate foundation garment slip and 2 layers of nylon net petticoat, required significantly more management than modern clothing. Sitting down meant a deliberate conscious redistribution of the skirt's volume, gathering it forward and to the sides before contact with the seat, to prevent the nylon net from bunching awkwardly beneath the body or billowing up in an embarrassing display of underpinning. Walking through a doorway required a slight lateral compression of the skirt with both hands, applied briefly at the hips, to prevent the width from catching on the doorframe in either direction. Navigating a restaurant booth, entering a car, passing through a crowd, all of these ordinary activities required a continuous, largely unconscious physical awareness of the garment's footprint in space that the wearer absorbed through practice until it became instinctive. Women who wore these silhouettes daily described the adjustment as genuine and lasting. They became, over months and years, differently bodily aware than they had been before and differently than they were after the silhouette changed. The starched cotton of the shirtwaist dress, the decades ubiquitous daytime garment for the middle-class American woman at home and at informal social engagements, brought its own physical logic. A well-starched shirtwaist held its collar crisply, its cuffs precisely, its bodice smoothly, in a way that required specific laundering and pressing procedures to achieve and maintain. The cotton had to be washed in water hot enough to ensure complete cleaning, wrung carefully to prevent distortion of the weave, and dried to a specific degree of dampness before pressing, too dry, and the fabric would not accept the iron's smoothing action effectively. Too damp and the result would be limp rather than crisp. The pressing itself required an iron with a functional steam function, a pressing cloth for the collar and cuffs to prevent shine, and the knowledge of which direction to press each seam to preserve the garment's construction integrity. This was not a simple skill. It was not an innate skill. It was a learned skill, acquired through instruction and practice, and its execution was one of the invisible daily competencies of the 1950s domestic woman that the period simultaneously required, expected, and entirely failed to acknowledge as expertise. The hat requirement of mid-decade dress codes, specifically the requirement that a woman's head be covered for church attendance, for formal afternoon engagements, and for any occasion of civic formality, placed the millinery trade in a position of unusual cultural significance. The hat was the garment most directly visible during movement through public space. It announced the wearer's presence before the face was fully resolved, and it communicated, in the compressed language of its shape, colour, and angle of placement, information about the wearer's social intentions for the occasion. A pillbox hat worn level on the crown communicated formal daytime elegance. The same hat tilted forward over the brow communicated sophistication with a slightly theatrical edge. A wide-brimmed hat in a summer fabric, straw or organdy, communicated social informality of the elevated kind appropriate to a garden party or a matinee. The cocktail hat, a small confection of veiling and velvet or feathers or artificial flowers, perched at the front or side of the head and anchored with pearl-tipped pins, communicated an occasion of late afternoon formality that occupied a specific niche in the social calendar and required its own specific accessories. The accessories question in general, the matching of hat, gloves, handbag and shoes, was approached by the 1955 fashion press with the methodical comprehensiveness of a technical specification. The rule that accessories should match, modified by the rule that matching everything created an appearance of excessive coordination that read as effortful rather than natural, produced a calibration challenge that fashion editors addressed in varying ways across the decade. The simplest version of the rule was, shoes and bag should match, or at least occupy the same colour family. Hat and gloves might correspond to each other, or to the dress rather than to the shoe-bag pairing. A single accent colour could run through two elements of the accessory combination, but should not dominate all of them. The execution of this system, in a wardrobe of limited size, which was most women's wardrobe, despite the impression that magazine photography of the period might create, required a strategy of versatile neutral investments. A black calf handbag, navy or camel court shoes, a pair of white cotton gloves. These were the reliable foundations around which seasonal colour could be layered and rotated without requiring a new accessory purchase for every outfit occasion. The question of what constituted appropriate public versus private dress, the threshold at which a woman needed to present herself as fully assembled rather than in a state of domestic informality, was actively debated in the 1950s magazine press, and the debate is revealing. The more traditional position held that any interaction with the outside world, the postman, the grocery delivery, the neighbour at the front door, required the woman to be fully dressed, meaning at minimum a housecoat over her nightgown was insufficient, and she should be in a day dress with her hair combed. The more progressive position, energetically advanced by several younger editors at women's magazines, held that the domestic sphere was genuinely private, and that a woman's presentation within it was her own business, and not the world's. The progressive position was losing the argument in 1955, but it was articulating it, which was something. By 1963, when Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique appeared in bookstores, the argument had gathered considerably more ammunition. But in 1955, the argument was still largely being conducted on the magazine page, and the woman in Shaker Heights, or Levittown, or Anaheim was, in general, putting on her house dress and her lipstick, before opening the front door to the mailman, not because she'd analysed the power dynamics involved and concluded this was correct, but because the alternative felt, in the specific cultural temperature of 1955, like letting the side down in a way she couldn't quite name but deeply felt. In the summer of 1941, the War Production Board of the United States government classified lipstick as an essential wartime material and exempted it from the metal rationing orders that had restricted the production of cosmetics cases. The reasoning, as articulated in internal memos that were later made public, was entirely pragmatic. Lipstick maintained civilian morale, particularly among women working in war industry positions, and civilian morale was a logistical asset of measurable military value. The British government reached the same conclusion slightly earlier, with Winston Churchill reportedly instructing the Board of Trade in 1942 that lipstick production was not to be curtailed because the effect of cosmetics on women's psychological fortitude was a strategic consideration. Whether or not Churchill said precisely this, the quotation appears in secondary sources and its provenance is imprecise. The policy was real. Lipstick was armour. Government said so in writing. By the time the post-war period arrived and America's women returned from their factory and administrative positions to the suburban homes that ideology had been building for them since 1946, the red lip carried all of that wartime history in its pigment, and the industry that sold it understood this perfectly. Revlon's Charles Revson, who had built his company through the 1930s on the radical premise that nail colour and lip colour should be sold as a coordinated system rather than as separate products, launched his Fire and Ice campaign in November of 1952 with a full-page advertisement in Harper's Bazaar that is still studied in advertising programs today. The advertisement consisted of a photograph of the model, Dorian Lee, in a sequined silver gown and a scarlet lip, accompanied by a quiz, 23 questions that asked, in increasingly audacious language, whether the reader was the kind of woman who wore fire and ice. Did she paint her toenails in winter? Did she dance till 3 a.m? Did she cry at weddings? The quiz was not about lipstick, it was about permission, specifically the permission to be complicated, to want things, to be the kind of woman who was too much and intended to remain so. Revlon sold more lipstick in the 3 months following that advertisement than in any equivalent period in the company's history. Tangy, the brand whose natural orange-red shade had dominated the American lipstick market since the 1920s, occupied a different position in the post-war landscape than Revlon, and found that position increasingly uncomfortable. Tangy's original selling point had been its technology. The formula's pigments shifted on contact with individual skin chemistry to produce a personalised colour that was never quite the same on any two women. In 1923, this was a remarkable innovation and an effective advertising message. By 1952, the shift-on-contact gimmick read as genteel, and genteel was losing the cultural conversation to Revlon's frank, aggressive chromatic confidence. Women in 1952 wanted red, and they wanted a red that was unambiguously, unequivocally, defiantly red, not a red that politely adjusted itself to their particular biology. Tangi spent the decade attempting to reformulate its way back to relevance and achieved only partial success. The market had moved beneath it. The formulation challenges of mid-century lipstick were substantial, and the companies that solved them reaped disproportionate rewards. The primary failure mode of 1940s and early 50s lipstick was feathering, the tendency of the pigment to migrate from the lip line into the fine vertical lines above and below the lip, producing a bleeding effect that destroyed the clean geometric precision that the era's beauty standards required. Hazel Bishop, who had been working as a research chemist for a cosmetics manufacturer before founding her own company in 1950, approached the feathering problem with the rigour of a laboratory researcher rather than a beauty industry veteran, and arrived at a bromo-acid-based formula that bonded to the protein structure of the lip's surface, rather than merely sitting on top of it. Her no-smear lipstick, launched in 1950, remained on the lip through eating, drinking, and the application of social pressure that the decade regularly applied to a woman's face. It was, in the technical sense, a genuinely better product. In the commercial sense, it was a phenomenon. Bishop's company went from $0 to $1 million in sales in its first year. The cultural work that the red lip performed in the 1950s was sufficiently complex that different women experienced it in genuinely different ways, depending on their social position, their aspirations, and the specific semantic context in which they wore it. For the suburban housewife whose daily life had contracted significantly from the professional or social range it had occupied during the war years, a red lip on a Tuesday morning was a private assertion, a statement made in the bathroom mirror for no specific audience, that she had not entirely become the domestic role that had largely consumed her. For the professional woman navigating a mid-century office, in which the baseline assumption was still that her presence was temporary, pending marriage, a confident red lip was a studied element of an aesthetic argument she was making about her seriousness. For the teenager experimenting with adult cosmetics for the first time, the red lip was pure potential, the cosmetic marker of an adult femininity that was approaching and that she was rehearsing in the bathroom with the door locked, with a pleasure that was entirely about possibility. The modern relationship with red lipstick, which has survived the complete dissolution of the mid-century behavioural system that surrounded it, and emerged not as an antique but as one of the most culturally persistent cosmetic gestures in the Western tradition, is interesting precisely because of what has been retained and what has been shed. The specific social codes, the matching of red to outfit, the avoidance of red in certain professional contexts, the relationship between red lip and certain categories of moral judgment have largely dissolved. What remains is the core meaning that Revlon's Fire and Ice campaign was distilling when it asked those 23 audacious questions in 1952. The red lip as a mark of intentionality, of the decision to be seen, of the willingness to take up the visual space that the colour commands. Women in the 1950s wore red lipstick because the decade required it, because the culture prescribed it, because their mothers wore it, because Revlon's advertising told them to. They also wore it because something about the weight of the bullet on the lip and the specific private moment of its application produced reliably a feeling that no other cosmetic gesture exactly replicated, a feeling of having decided something, a feeling of readiness. The decade is gone. The feeling is not. The pigment chemistry that gave 1950s red lipstick its characteristic depth and intensity was the product of a set of innovations that had begun in the 1920s and reached their fullest commercial expression in the decade following the war. The bromo acids, specifically D&C Red number 21 and its eosine cousins, were the category's most important technological development, and their significance lay in their behaviour on contact with the lip surface. Unlike traditional lipstick pigments, which deposited a layer of colour on top of the lip surface and were therefore subject to mechanical removal by eating, drinking and speaking, The bromo acids reacted with the amino acids present in skin and mucous membrane tissue to produce a stain that penetrated the cellular surface and resisted ordinary mechanical removal. The colour that resulted from this chemical bond was slightly different from the colour of the product in the tube. Bromo acids undergo a molecular shift on contact with the skin's slightly alkaline environment that moves their colour from orange-red to a deeper bluish red. But the difference was reproducible and predictable, and the manufacturers who understood the chemistry could formulate for the on-skin colour rather than the in-tube colour. Hazel Bishop understood this. Charles Revson, whose chemistry background was less robust, but whose commercial instincts were exceptional, hired people who understood it. The lipstick that stained rather than merely coating the lip was the decade's most significant formulation achievement, and it transformed the category. The relationship between the red lip and the rest of the face's cosmetic presentation was governed in the 1950s by a logic of balance that was more nuanced than the period's reputation for visual excess might suggest. The strong red lip demanded a reduction elsewhere. The eyes were typically kept in neutral browns and soft liner, rather than the dramatic wing that a softer lip colour permitted. The foundation was worn in a matte, carefully blended manner that provided a smooth ground rather than competing with the lip for visual attention. The blush was applied sparingly and in warm-tone naturalistic shades, rather than the dramatic rouge that an earlier decade would have applied. The total effect was not that the face was wearing the lipstick so much as the lipstick was wearing the face. The red lip as the organising principle around which every other element of the presentation was arranged. This required a degree of cosmetic confidence that not all women of the period possessed, which is precisely why the red lip carried such reliable social weight when deployed correctly. The specific geography of red lipstick's social acceptability in the 1950s was mapped with a precision that reflected the decade's general tendency to regulate female behaviour at the level of specific circumstance. Red was unambiguously correct for evening wear, for formal afternoon occasions, and for any context in which the full ceremonial registers of mid-century femininity were appropriate. It was acceptable, with somewhat reduced depth of application, for professional daytime wear in most contexts, the caveat being that professional women in certain very conservative fields or companies maintained a policy of softer lip colours during business hours that communicated seriousness without sacrificing femininity, a balance that the 1950s required women to strike with exhausting regularity. For casual daytime activity, the school run, the grocery store, the informal neighbourhood social, a red lip was worn but muted. The same Revlon fire and ice, or the same Tangy red, blotted twice with a tissue to reduce saturation and create a stained rather than saturated effect. The stained red lip was the casual version of the full red lip, and was as much a 1950s signature as its more fully achieved counterpart. The figure of the woman applying red lipstick, reflected in a compact mirror, in a car's rearview mirror, in the mirror of a department store powder room, accumulated through the decade an iconographic weight that its individual practitioners were almost certainly not consciously cultivating, but that the culture was actively building around them. Photographers of the period, both commercial and fine art, returned to the image repeatedly. The upward tilt of the chin, the slight parting of the lips for the applicator's passage, the concentrated attention that the brief specific act required. The act was simultaneously intimate and public. Intimate because it involved direct attention to one's own face in a concentrated, privately observing way. Public because the result was immediately and entirely visible, was in fact the most visible single element of the face. The woman applying lipstick was a woman in transition between private self and public presentation, and the camera, when it caught this moment, was documenting something that the culture found endlessly interesting, without being able to articulate precisely why. The wartime legacy of the red lip, its official endorsement as a morale tool, its association with the productive, capable, economically participating women of the war effort years, gave it a specific political valence in the early 1950s that its constant commercial deployment gradually obscured but never entirely erased. When a woman in 1952 applied a bold red lip before walking into a professional setting, an office, a government bureau, a hospital, she was carrying a visual argument that the wartime decade had established and that the post-war domestic ideology was actively attempting to retire. The argument was, I am capable, I am here, I am not temporary, and I am wearing red. The commercial machinery of Revlon and Hazel Bishop and Tangi was not interested in this argument as such. It was interested in selling lipstick. But arguments about women's presence in the world can be made through commercial objects as effectively as through political documents, and the red lip was, in the 1950s, both. It was a commercial object and a political object, a beauty product and a declaration, a formula of bromo acid staining cellular tissue, and a statement about who had the right to occupy space. It sold for $1.50. It said considerably more than that. What the 1950s beauty industry told women, assembled across all of its channels and its products, and its advertisements, and its magazine columns, and its charm school curricula, and its cold cream rituals. What it told them, in sum, was, your appearance is a project, and the project is never finished, and the project matters, and the project is yours to manage, and if you manage it correctly, the world will receive you correctly. This was both a burden and a gift, in proportions that varied by the individual woman's experience of it. The burden is obvious in retrospect. The relentlessness of the standard, the invisibility of the labour, the way that the most expertly managed project was the one whose management was least visible, so that the most competent women appeared to be doing the least. The gift is less obvious but no less real. The knowledge, transmitted through ritual and product and technique, and the patient accumulation of daily practice, that you were capable of producing something deliberate and beautiful from what you were given. That the raw material could be shaped, that the shaping was a skill, that the skill was yours. Women in the 1950s applied cold cream and liquid liner and red lipstick and setting lotion and pressed powder and foundation and mascara and toner and night cream, and they did it every day, and they got better at it, and they taught their daughters, and the daughters got better still. The industry that sold them the tools was interested in profit. The women who used those tools were interested in something more complicated than the industry ever quite understood. Not the acquisition of beauty, but the practice of it, and the strange, private, accumulating competence that daily practice, in any discipline, produces over time.